Thank you for coming and for being so nice about it. I was feeling incredibly nervous, still am a little bit, and then realized that this is not one of those contexts where your colleagues are likely to eat you. Challenge, but this is not the economics or political science department at UC Irvine, and I have to keep that in mind. That's very reassuring. So thank you for coming and for being so welcoming. The topic for today, from Brawling to, oh, I'm sorry.
The mic down a little bit, trying to get better.
Are you suggesting I'm short? Yes. So the topic is at the intersection of research and teaching for a couple of practical reasons. One is that my teaching life is full and does not necessarily leave lots of extra time for research, and this seems like sort of a useful way of being forward to move forward with the topic I had been working on, which is deliberation, and we'll talk more about that. But it seems like a way to move forward on research in a way that is compatible with teaching life, and coincidentally, the topics actually happen to fit well together. So the research that I've done is really in the field of democratic theory. What makes for a good democracy? What can you realistically aspire to? What does that look like? How do you get it? Those kinds of questions. And in particular, I have focused on deliberation, and we'll spend lots of time on that. But in brief, deliberation is just the idea of reasoned discussion as a medium for democracy, as a way of making democratic decisions. Deliberation has other meanings and other contexts that rely more on individual reflection, but in democratic theory, it's the interaction between people. So that is the research side that I'm coming from, and in teaching, I actually use a lot of discussion, which is kind of bizarre when you consider how well discussion tends not to go. And at this point, I'm reminded that when I'm talking about my teaching, I tend to make it sound like a train wreck. And then people afterwards come up to me and they say, I'm sure you're doing okay, as though I'm in danger of imploding. And, actually my classes do often look like train wrecks, but I think they're productive, and I think the fact that I'm actually interested in the train wreck is part of what recommends me to this career. So I talk about teaching in somewhat disparaging terms because it's bizarre, given the silences, the bizarre tangents, that it's actually a mode of teaching I like. And so we'll come back to that. But I'm also interested in education for democracy, not just memorizing branches of government, but how is it that students, and political science majors in particular, but all students, come out better citizens? What does that look like? So these are the different interests that I'm going to be bringing together, and I'm going to start a little bit more on the deliberation side just to provide some context, you are here dot. In part because when you tell people, say relatives at Thanksgiving, that your research is on deliberation, and deliberation means discussion, they look at you like, really? That's it? I mean, it's so common sense that it's a very difficult thing to talk about as a serious academic topic. And actually, I think that's part of why the literature hasn't been as good as I think it should be, is because there is so much common sense that gets in the way. I'll have to think about that more. I hadn't really thought about that before I said it. So the context in part goes to why can people spend a decade and a whole lot of ink on this topic. It's not new. Socrates, certainly Aristotle talked about discussion and its contribution to decision making. You've got John Stuart Mill and Rousseau and all of the big guys. There's some element of discussion in there. Part of what makes this moment in democratic theory unique is, of course, how it relates to the other moments that came before, and two in particular. One has to do with ripples in social theory more generally, particularly anti-foundationalism and postmodernism. So many different disciplines have gone through upheavals in response to the argument that there are not cosmic foundations that we can all agree on that underpin our knowledge. And in fact, knowledge is generated and validated by specific kinds of communities, religious communities, scientific communities, certainly disciplinary communities. And so given the disappearance of kind of foundations which are comforting, if you can just find the right foundation, then everything else is supposed to fall into place kind of magically. So if you don't have your foundations, then how do you justify democratic values and democratic decisions? And deliberation provides a way of talking about how we generate the foundations collectively that we want to use as the basis for our decisions. So it is an interesting response to that fairly contemporary debate in a bunch of different disciplines. And then specifically in political science, the discussion about deliberation is important because of what's been happening in political science for the last, way too long. But especially, say, the last 20 to 30 years, rational choice theory has really been the dominant theory. And now there are now lots of people who are making their living rejecting rational choice theory. But for a long time, the focus has been more on voting as the primary means of participation. And it has treated voters as consumers who are shopping for candidates or policies in a political marketplace. And that seems like an incredibly thin conception of citizenship. It makes citizens reactive to the ideas that are out there as opposed to generative. And it means that we all have our own preferences. And again, much of this language is borrowed from economics, and we can rationally order our preferences. We don't necessarily change them, and we just find the person that matches our pre-existing preferences. And so that seems like a really hard way to live together if all we're doing, and not very interesting really, if all we're doing is trying to pick the person, and we don't change our preferences, we don't develop, and what is this? So this idea of rational choice really has been, in part because it's so nice in mathematical terms, and there are lots of big fancy equations that go with it, it's really dominated the big political science journals in the 80s and 90s. And while there's a pushback against that, deliberation is one of the key areas of work that is leading the pushback against deliberation. And what deliberation theorists have worried about are things like, what is deliberation? What makes it unique as a form of discussion? What principles should guide deliberation? What does it take for deliberation to really be democratic? And there's even a research literature that's been emerging that's primarily case studies that looks at deliberation in different contexts, either formally in government context, deliberation in Congress, deliberation in making constitutions, or in various and sundry citizen contexts. And there are a surprising number to choose from. Local communities use some form of deliberative engagement in rethinking their master plan. There are now consulting firms out there that can come in and help your community, college, whatever, do this. And it really is based on getting people to talk to each other and work towards some sort of consensus that can ground community decisions. In some countries, it's actually a more formal part of policymaking. England uses citizen juries, deliberative citizen juries, in some elements of healthcare policy. So there are things out there to study, and primarily so far, case studies. So it's a pretty, while this has been developing for better than a decade, it's still a fairly young literature. And where I came into it, and there's one distinction I want to call attention to. As people write, you start to see the divisions. And the one I found was sort of an oh no moment as I was happily writing a paragraph in the intro to my dissertation, and I realized that something really basic I'd been assuming didn't hold true for half the authors I was talking about. But it was one of those things that had been left sort of unspoken. So there are the people who talk about deliberation in the public sphere, in media, by commentators, and then how that kind of permeates deliberation out there in popular consciousness. And other people are talking about real face-to-face citizen decision-making contexts. And there's a really important question to be asked about how similar is deliberation that happens through the media versus deliberation that happens when people are sitting down and looking each other in the eye. The part of deliberation that I focused on primarily is the face-to-face decision-making. And the question I posed in my dissertation had to do with how do you think about power in that context. And I think there's some opportunities to apply that to the classroom as well. I haven't quite made it that far. I'm assuming I'll get there eventually. But what this did lead me to is to thinking about how is discussion in the classroom similar to or different from democratic deliberation, and what might these two contexts have to say to each other in a useful way. So this is my transition to kind of the teaching side of deliberation. I have used discussion in part because with all of its horrible moments, it's actually for me a more comfortable way of teaching. I hate the glaze. You know, you start talking and you see them go. And I feel like if they had a remote, they'd just change the channel, and the only reason they don't is they can't. I think it's just kind of in the nature of the interaction and in, cultures training, television cultures training. But if I have a discussion-based classroom, I feel like they're alive and I'm alive, and occasionally we get some really great moments out of it. And part of my interest in thinking about this is how to make more really good moments and how to make it as useful as possible so that it's actually got pedagogical value. Now, I do think that there are some really sound pedagogical reasons for using a lot of discussion in the classroom. And part of this comes from Piaget. Somehow, I thought I was doing a political science degree, but I ended up with a lot of background in developmental psychology, and I'm still kind of trying to sort that out. But thinking about cognitive development, when you're looking at Piaget and plenty of other people, characterizes thinking as an activity. So the whole idea of active learning doesn't quite make sense in Piagetian terms because learning is itself an activity. Until students are thinking and building connections, nothing's going on. You don't have learning. And so discussion provides students an opportunity where they are actually making those connections, reflecting on their previously held assumptions, and trying it out in class and getting feedback. And feedback's another important element for Piaget, that part of how you learn is you get feedback, and it either reinforces how you're thinking or it causes you to readjust. And ideally, ideal or not, he argues that there's a developmental trajectory where the connections we're making between things and even the objects themselves become increasingly complex. So Congress moves from being a sort of undifferentiated entity out there blocking the president or passing the president's agenda, and it becomes a more complex universe. And part of that's having more information, but part of it is being able to deal with multiple complex relationships at the same time. So you couldn't really teach this to a fourth grader very effectively because they just don't have the cognitive software to manage the different relationships. So discussion helps with testing these relationships and seeing how they work and hearing about other relationships and thinking these through. So there is, it's not just a comfort thing. There are plenty of people out there in pedagogy land arguing that discussion ought to be a more important part of how we teach. And then again, from the political science side, it's one way to get at engaged learning, trying to get students actively interested in participating in the political and social world. So given that view of discussion, the question I pose is, are deliberation and class discussion just the same thing, or are these different things, and what makes them different? If you look for a basic definition of deliberation in the literature, first of all, you figure out that not everybody's using the same definition, but that's not much of a surprise. The core definition that does persist is reasoned discussion. Now, people get all tied up over what counts as reasoned discussion, what about demagogues, what about the place of, passionate arguments and deliberation. But at the core, there's this idea that it's discussion based on giving, evaluating, weighing, rejecting reasons. It's about making arguments for each other and being willing to change our own perspective when we're confronted with arguments that may actually push us in new directions. So it's not just about jousting, about knocking your opponent off of their argument. It's also about an interaction with other people that is in some sense collaborative. So that element of reasoned discussion pervades pretty much all of the political theory literature on deliberation. But it seems like there's another element as well that doesn't show up clearly until you take it out of the political science context. And then you realize, oh yeah, the rest of the world doesn't always think this way. It's not just reasoning collaboratively, but it's also reasoning towards some sort of end or decision. The reason why we need deliberation or democracy more generally is because we are living together, kind of stuck with each other in a sense, under conditions of plurality. We have a lot of different values, different aspirations and goals, limited resources. We're stuck with each other, and we have to make decisions about how are we going to do that. And democracy is what allows us to make decisions that are minimally coercive. So we get to participate in shaping the decisions so that when we have to abide by them, they're decisions that we have chosen for ourselves. And so this element of needing to come to a shared position is part of what makes democratic deliberation distinctive as compared with other kinds of discussion. And I think you see this when you look at how discussion tends to proceed in classrooms. It doesn't necessarily have those goals. And I have, just in thinking about this, I haven't really probed the literature a lot to see what kinds of typologies for analyzing discussion are out there. But it seems to me that I at least have two basic approaches to discussion in my classrooms. One is a more Socratic approach where there's an endpoint that I'm trying to get to, and I'm asking questions in an attempt to draw students in a direction that I've already decided we're going. And I want them to participate in that because I want them to understand the logic of how we got there. So we're kind of back to Piaget. Because if I just told them the connections, they could write them down and memorize them, but that would have a different cognitive value than if they come to see the connection themselves. And so you use kind of the give and take to move them through a process of reasoning. This also goes nicely with the developmental work of Vygotsky, who talks about scaffolding, or at least that's the term that's attributed to him. I'm not sure that he used it. But the idea that you put structures in place to help students through processes that are more complex than they can automatically do themselves, in hopes that giving them that opportunity to practice with guidance provides the foundation where they'll be able to do it themselves later without your help. So in using a Socratic approach to discussion, you're giving students the experience of making an argument in a guided context, and you hope, fingers crossed, that some of those argument-making skills carry over into writing an essay or making arguments in other contexts. So that's one kind of discussion. The other kind of discussion is the, well, gee, what did you think about that discussion? What I'm calling the open-ended expressive discussion. Because what you want in that context is for students to really just practice articulating their own ideas. And you may want to help them realize that there are other ideas out there. You don't necessarily need agreement. You just need that experience of getting students to actually speak up and say something, and that is not to be underestimated. I mean, the more that I work with students on trying to write essays, the more I worry about whether our students are capable, that is supported, in creating arguments for themselves that they care about. I mean, we have this context where it's so much about figuring out what the instructor wants that if I tell students, I want you to make an argument that you find interesting about this piece of writing, here are the parameters, but you need to find something you think is interesting to talk about, that's not something they do easily or automatically. And so actually providing students with the opportunity of sort of brainstorming or sharing ideas in class, I actually think is valuable, even though it's incredibly prone to tangents, it's sprawling all over the place. People kind of use somebody else's comment as a springboard for their own agenda. They don't respond to it. It's the pretty haphazard form of discussion, but I think that things are happening in there that are valuable. The other thing that form of discussion does, as I mentioned briefly, is it exposes them to the fact that other people think differently. Again, not to be underestimated. And I think for all of us, there are things that we tend to take for granted. It doesn't even occur to us that there's another way of thinking about it, a different way of understanding it. And so just providing the opportunity for ideas to kind of bump into each other is an important function that discussion serves. But because that's the function, you're not trying to really coordinate the perspectives at that point. You're just trying to provide a forum for the perspectives to emerge. So it's quite a different thing from deliberation. This is why I like PowerPoint projectors, is I don't have that experience of looking down and thinking, where are we now? Okay, so if we were going to try and create a deliberative discussion, what would be different from these things? First of all, it would still have the emphasis on reasoning, like the Socratic method, because you want people to really engage each other and understand where the other person is coming from and provide arguments to try and persuade each other. So you need them to actually try and coordinate their perspectives. Really pay attention to what somebody else is coming from and figure out why they think that. And should I be persuaded by that? So there's still an emphasis on argument and reasoning, but the end point is not set. And so when you think about this from scaffolding terms, you've pulled out one of the parts of the scaffold. It's sort of comforting in a Socratic discussion to know that somebody knows when you've gotten there, when the discussion stops. And so it's, in that sense, a somewhat more complex form of discussion. Furthermore, the argument is less guided because since I don't exactly know where we're going, I don't know what the steps in the argument need to be. And so students become responsible, or citizens in a deliberation, for generating the logic. It also requires that expressive element because you have to own, to some extent, the position that you're making. It isn't just figuring out what the next step is supposed to be, but how do I authentically, if that's a word I can use, think about this, and how does that relate to what this other person is saying? So it combines elements or perhaps skills of the other forms of discussion in ways that are more demanding. So this might make us a little cautious in thinking about deliberation in the classroom, given how well those other two may or may not go on a regular basis. So this is part of why the talks about pedagogy of deliberation, because this arguably is something that if our students are going to be able to do, or we as citizens are going to be able to do, it's something that we actually need to learn how to do. And anyone who's taught I&E is reminded, oh, so vividly, that discussion is not a skill that people come with. And so if you provide students with a nice, complex, meaty piece of writing and 3 or 4 discussion questions, and you give them 20 minutes to talk about it, they're done in 5. Because that's all that is required. I mean, it's not just that they're lazy, but that's all they see that there is to talk about. And so teaching students how to explore topics, how to probe things more deeply is one of the skills that we start cultivating. So by the time they're seniors, you can actually get pretty robust, satisfying discussions that get more into the nuances of issues. But it has to be taught, and so the question is, how do we teach it? One of the texts that I have read on discussion, while it is geared towards a broad teaching audience, they do come out of democratic theory and talk about deliberation specifically, and had this so enticing statement of how deliberation goes in their classrooms. In our own teaching, we have found the ideal of deliberation to be especially elusive. Specifically, we find that our interest in carving out a safe and hospitable space for people to speak, a place where they can feel affirmed and acknowledged, is itself so difficult that the standard of deliberation must often wait for later. Consequently, the semester is usually more than half over before we think that students in our class are starting to hold one another accountable for clear and well-substantiated arguments. I need to put that on my wall because I keep forgetting that, and we'll come back to kind of the developmental progression repeatedly. Okay, so that suggests, first of all, that it's daunting. Doesn't happen automatically, and you have to build toward it, which requires a level of planning that challenges some of us who are planning challenged, or at least organizationally challenged. So it's not easy, but I think there are important reasons to try anyway. Arguably, it is both more important and more endangered in the public culture than it has been previously. Talking to students who have been working on campaigns, they come back with just the most amazing stories, and I'm sure this has happened, for a long time, that this is not new, but you'd think we'd grow out of it. Not just yard signs being stolen, but one of them was forced off the road in his car. Things were thrown at his car, presumably because it had the wrong bumper sticker, because the person that drove by waved a sign from the opposing political candidate as they drove by. I mean, this is a culture that is not perhaps succeeding at deliberation. I mean, part of why we have deliberation is so that we don't have to resort to fisticuffs. So arguably, this is something that is a social good that we want to cultivate. And that we might look at elements of culture that make that more challenging. Certainly, the fact that people spend more time engaging electronically than talking face-to-face is one obstacle, and I don't want to go on the tangent of electronic opportunities for deliberation, though there's certainly plenty to explore there. But we're not necessarily getting better at face-to-face discussion. We've got tremendous political challenges that do require, I think, deliberation and cultivating a shared sense of what should we do and where do we go now. And if we want students to be able to do this, or citizens, they have to learn it somewhere. And classrooms provide one of the most broadly shared experiences, and hence a unique opportunity for creating some sort of shared deliberative culture. And if we do it, then we can participate in creating the political culture we want. That's not in an ideological sense of we want lefties or righties. That's in the sense of we want students who can take each other seriously and have a really good substantive discussion. That's the political culture I aspire to. And hence, that's part of why I think even though this is going to be difficult, it's worth trying. And I'm going to give you a case study of the one that worked. Given the fact that this case is probably 2 years, 3 years old now, and this is only my 4th year, how old can it be? But it's not recent. That tells you how many great cases I have to draw on where this has really gone well, though we'll talk about why that is. As I think about how do you create the opportunity for deliberation in the classroom, deliberation poses a couple of unique challenges. One is that this need for a decision. That doesn't fit very well in classrooms, which really aren't terribly democratic. There are 2 constraints. One, students don't tend to have input on consequential decisions. So that right there provides one opportunity where we might cultivate deliberation. We might strategically select a decision that would matter to students that they could participate in making. But the other thing is that a lot of the things we do discuss don't need a decision. That there are plenty of arenas in literature or political science where it's fine to say, interesting that you think that way. I think you're a tad nuts, but that's fine. I mean, there isn't a need to persuade each other. You know, it's kind of fun to try just to see where the argument goes, but there isn't a compelling investment in the argument. And part of where deliberation gets its cognitive oomph is from that effort to try and coordinate and work with diverse perspectives. And so you need something where students feel compelled to hang in there. If they're not compelled, they opt out in oh so many ways. They stop coming to class. They stop speaking. They simply stop caring. And so if we're going to really kind of reflect a political community where decisions have to be made, we have to find issues where it makes sense. Even if we don't make a decision, we feel that there is something at stake in whether we come to similar or different understandings. And so what kinds of issues might it matter whether we can get agreement or not? And the case I'm going to talk about kind of emerged, and I think that's significant. It wasn't something that I set out planning to do. I had to readjust my syllabus in order to deal with this issue. But it was generated by the students. So I was happily teaching an American government class that very quickly became oddly tense. The level of hostility in the room was kind of interesting. It wasn't an election year, I don't think, at least if it was a congressional election. But there were definitely parts of the room that had very strong ideas, and they really didn't agree with each other. And the difference of opinion was kind of in the background. It wasn't on the surface of any of the issues we were talking about. There were sort of different premises that people were working from that kept sort of bumping into each other. There'd be like this little explosion of discussion where people would start yelling at each other, but it wasn't really clear what the topic was. And it became apparent, I mean, you could tell that it was a liberal-conservative split around economic issues, and it really became a question about opportunity in America. And so, given the fact that this mattered very much to the students, and we kept sort of having the same conversations over and over again and not getting anywhere, I blocked off a day to talk about opportunity in America. Now, there are any number of ways you could talk about this, including bringing in lots of additional reading. And that might have been of some value, but what I was really interested in was why they couldn't seem to communicate with each other in a way that anybody in the room could really understand or feel good about. Students were invested, and there's definitely a sense in which they felt like their collective futures depend on, to some extent, how this question is answered. So even though my class can't make an authoritative decision about opportunity in America, the nature of that, what it ought to be, who's responsible for providing it, there's still a sense in which they feel like the decision matters and they recognize it as being collectively important, and so they were willing to really work on trying to figure it out. I set aside one full class period where we tackled maybe 4 questions. It was very carefully structured, and it was slow, and that's problematic when you're trying to cover lots of material, so you couldn't do it all the time. But it was, to this day, one of the best discussions I've ever seen, and changed my relationship with a number of the students and their relationship with each other, which again goes back to why this is important for a divided political community facing all sorts of really big challenges. We need to find ways that we can cooperate even if we aren't necessarily huge fans of each other. And so the transformative nature was very useful. The question posed was, is there equal or adequate economic opportunity in the U.S.? Now, it was a question on the board, and then I allowed students to self-select into 4 different groups. Students who felt quite strongly that there was not equal or adequate opportunity, students who felt quite strongly that there is, and then students who either didn't want to take a clear position or really weren't sure. And it turned out that that was about half the class, and so we allowed that to be 2 groups. Students self-selected into the groups. Fortunately, they turned out to be fairly comparable sizes. And it was important for me to allow self-selection because I really wanted them to think about what their existing assumptions and beliefs were. And I would pose a question. I'd give them an opportunity to write individually, to think about what their own views were, to discuss it as a group, and then the groups would check in with each other. And that's really all we did for a class period. This was kind of deliberative in a couple of ways, and I'll talk about what exactly worked in a moment. But from the deliberative perspective, it was a combination of kind of giving them an opportunity to express their views and probing their logic. It seemed like the expressive part was important because we weren't going to get to the logic until they had the opportunity to get off their chest whatever it was that they were thinking. While there wasn't a decision, there were clearly collective implications, so I think it fit deliberation in that sense. We did go for mutual understanding and a respect for other people's positions rather than agreement, but the mutual understanding and recognition seems to me to be a precursor for agreement, and that seemed to be the more important thing that we needed. What ended up working, several features. First of all, a couple of the questions were especially important. The first question, what counts as equal opportunity and how do you know it when you see it, was kind of the fundamental question. It goes at the differences, when people look at the world, who do they see? I mean, for a long time I thought our clashes were primarily about values, questions of what should we do as a policy. But before you get to those clashes, there's the basic question of what's happening in the world. And to the extent that people have really different understandings of what is happening in the world, it makes it really hard to get to the policy question about what should we do. So we started with, how do you see the world and what's going on out there? And the follow-up question that I came back to several times was important. Do you find the reasoning that so-and-so just offered persuasive? Why or why not? And so we might do a round about how do you know equal opportunity when you see it? And something would emerge, somebody would give a pretty well fleshed out argument or an example, and then we'd pause at that point and do another round with, well, what do you think about this example? Gave people an opportunity to reflect in groups and then talk back to the class. And that follow-up about what is persuasive, why or why not, I thought really did a nice job of helping students understand, because, I mean, they thought they had the answers. They were so sure that their examples and their evidence were compelling that they couldn't figure out why, when they kept using the same examples and evidence over and over again, it didn't make a difference. And so this was looking at what persuades people and where are we really not understanding each other very well. And that was surprisingly useful. And then this use of groups, allowing people to select into groups, was, I think, really important, because these were issues that people felt very intensely about. And there was one woman in particular who was kind of the standard bearer for the conservative position in class. And I had a number of fairly vocal liberal students. And so she was feeling kind of beaten up because she'd stick herself out there and kaboom, the front right corner of the class would pile on. And so by providing group, but slowly there were a number, she was a little bit older returning student, and there were a number of students that kind of gravitated back towards her corner of the classroom as the semester progressed, because she was saying things that they felt, but they weren't necessarily comfortable in saying. So by allowing the groups to be explicit, it provided people with support and a sort of courage to make the argument. It also gave them a friendly audience to try their arguments with before they had to go live to the more difficult group. So I think that social context of agreement juxtaposed with the context of making an argument to people you don't agree with was nice. And then, even though we really only got to a few questions, slowing down the discussion was important. Allowing it to be a whole class period eased the intensity somewhat, and it broadened participation, because even people who did not speak to the group, to the large group, though more did on that day than I think any other day, they did participate in the small groups. And it made the discussion more thoughtful. There were fewer wild punches as people got into the intensity of the discussion and started throwing back the, what about this? No, what about that? I knew somebody who, had 5 kids, and the kind of back and forth that these discussions generate was muted in useful ways. That said, I still had somebody in the back of the room stand up and yell, "You're a communist," at somebody in the front of the room, which is when I learned that communist is still an epithet for the younger generation. I have to say, I was surprised. But, I mean, it didn't take, because they did care so much and they'd been thinking about it, it certainly didn't eliminate the intensity or the passion from the discussion, but it made it a little bit less scary. Because there are some students that really find that kind of intensity very off-putting. They're afraid to jump into it, and to some extent they don't even like listening to it. And so they'll tune out of an intense class discussion. So it made it all more manageable. There are other less successful cases, but what I would like, those are fun to talk about too. Tried to deliberate what ought to be the testable material from the reading. Oh, bad idea. Still working on that one. But the important thing is that there was success, and in a moment where it really gave me confidence that there's something here. And yet, given all of this, I have been an absolute chicken lately, and I'm trying to figure this out. Like, I have been ducking all of the tense discussions in class. You notice that there was a stem cell research proposition on the ballot? There are people who really want to talk about it, and we did eventually orchestrate it, and I had one class that did a very nice presentation on pros and cons. But I have found myself reluctant to go there, and we had an election. I very intensely felt election. And part of it is that I didn't trust myself. I mean, I teach political science because I care. You know, it's really, I can do the take a deep breath, stand back, and pretend like I don't, but it takes a lot of work. And to some extent, I wasn't comfortable going there with that. But I also had a number of students who didn't want to talk about it. People who were engaged, working on campaigns. I'd come in and say, want to talk about the election? No, don't want to talk about it. And that has been characteristic of 2 of my majors classes this semester. And it reminds me of that quotation that I used earlier about what does it take to get to deliberation in a class. I haven't done the groundwork this semester. First of all, you need a sense of community. You need people who care about each other and respect each other enough to be willing to engage. And for whatever reason, I have a bunch of students right now that really don't like each other. I mean, they're all lovely people. Many of them are seniors. It could just be, I'm tired, I'm out of here, I've dealt with you for 4 years, I don't want to do it anymore. But for whatever reason, that I skipped the community building, in part because I assumed with majors it was already there. And because who has time in class? There's lots of other stuff to cover. But clearly that makes people less willing to have different conversations when they don't like and trust each other. The other thing is that structuring a discussion has to be really thought through, and I haven't been giving myself the time to plan carefully what those discussions would look like. So it may be a small number of questions, but you have to set it up and you have to know what the questions are and why you're asking them, and what the important questions are. You also have to, I think, have your pulse on the class. I tried that successful discussion the following semester. I thought, oh, this is so cool, I'm going to do it every semester. Dud. Because they were not invested. The issue did not emerge from what they were thinking about. And so I think it takes both close attention to the class and the flexibility to say, all right, here's this class's issue and here's how we're going to deal with it. Beyond that, I would just like to, in the interest of cultivating a little deliberation, broach possibilities beyond the classroom and think about deliberation in the campus community. Starting from the premise that all environments educate. May not be the education you want, but all environments are educational in some sense. And it seems like the feeling that I've been having in my classroom about I just don't want to go there, I don't want to have this argument again, I don't know if these people can handle each other or I can handle any of them, it seems like that's somewhat characteristic of some of the discussions we've had on campus as a whole. When we talk about speaker policies and things of that nature, I mean, that's all about deliberation. Signposting on campus, can you put up political signs or not? That's about deliberation and what kind of public conversation are we going to have. And they're geared, I think, quite understandably, towards not having intense, out-of-control discussions. But I want to think about what this teaches for a moment. So what do students learn about themselves, their community, their world, if some positions are publicly off limits? You know, you can have your private opinion, but it can't be broached in public. What, first of all, does that do to the quality of the argument that's being cultivated by the person that holds those opinions? And what does it teach them about how to be citizens? You know, obviously the campus is not the world, but it's supposed to be preparation for it. So we might want to think about how those relate. And also, if students are allowed to simply make pronouncements about positions, but we try and keep them from engaging each other so that nothing gets out of control, what do you learn if you can just put an argument out there, but you don't have to hear how people answer back. That, I think, teaches something, too, about responsibility to arguments. If you protect people from the consequences of what they have to say, how do they learn how to play nice with others and be good citizens? And in general, what do citizens learn about, or students learn about citizenship if arguments about important policies are placed off limits or some issues are too hot for campus to handle? This is not an argument for open brawling on campus. It's a question about how campus conflicts can be teachable moments viewed through the lens of trying to cultivate a more deliberative political culture. And the role that not just my silly little political science class, but the campus as a whole might want to play in shaping that deliberative culture and the skills and resources that students have when they graduate and go out into that big, scary world where there are all sorts of wacky ideas. That's questions? Yes?
Is there any intent behind deliberation in your view beyond just utilitarian reasons for getting along in a society?
What do you have in mind? I mean, I think there are a number of reasons.
So for instance, in the argument about opportunity, either there is enough or there's not enough. Would that be correct?
That seemed to be the positions that people were thinking from, but hopefully there's a transformative quality too. And one might question whether that's even the right question. Is it a question of adequacy of opportunity? But I guess, so the question is, does this point in a normative direction, perhaps? Like, is there some sort of outcome that deliberation is likely to...
Is there going to be education involved by one side or the other? I mean, when I think of the Socratic method, I think of a method that never finds the answer, but it usually it takes away several answers. I mean, at least in the way it's formulated with Plato writes the Socratic method. So I'm thinking there are some questions that there are answers to, aren't there? And if there's not, then certainly I think for deliberation, the utilitarian way is the only way to go. So we can all function and not kill each other and brawl. But if there's something the society needs to accomplish, how do you accomplish those if you have 50-50 as opposed to just...
I think that this is actually a really pragmatic political problem, that if you do have a 50, I mean, to me, there's not an answer to that question. I have my answer, and I can provide my arguments for my answer, but there is not anybody out there to adjudicate, at least with political issues, the nature of the right answer. There are other kinds of knowledge, maybe issues of faith, where there are answers and there are authorities that can kind of be keepers of those answers or teach those answers. And even with political science or literature, there are arguments that people have arrived at that are the accepted arguments, and the experts, the professors, whoever publishes are kind of keepers of those answers. But in the political world, there aren't keepers of the answers. They are questions that we can only answer by persuading each other to some sort of common ground. And so the 50-50 split is pervasive, it's real, and it's very troubling because, we sort of look to somebody like the Supreme Court or the President to come in and say, this is what's going on, this is how we're going to understand it, and this is what we do. But until you've actually convinced people, they're just going to wait till the next election and get you back. So I think the persuasion really is a primarily pragmatic and I suppose utilitarian in thin sense.
Executive decisions aren't particularly democratic.
Right.
This is messy stuff.
Right. And I think with political questions.
That's the element, yeah.
Am I close to responding to what you were asking?
Well, I think so, because you did mention something about convincing people. So that would be the other reason or purpose behind deliberation, not just to be able to get along simply, but to become convinced. So, for instance, if I was arguing free trade is a great idea, I could take you down to Haiti and show you people enslaved picking avocados for America. And we might take another difference, a different viewpoint, but I don't know that we would agree to disagree that the people are there doing this thing.
Well, I think the convinced is important because that's how decisions that are made in democracies are tolerable. When you accept, even if you're not thrilled about the decision, if you accept it's reasonable and if you accept that you had some role in shaping the decision, then it becomes a decision that you can live with. When we have a 50-50 split and what prevails is just whoever has the greatest majority on that particular Tuesday, then the rest of the country is likely to experience those decisions as less legitimate. They'll be less committed to them, and I think that creates all sorts of problems for democracy when we can't figure out how to coordinate our political life because people just feel like so-and-so's, a Marxist and they're out stealing my wealth. I mean, that's not the foundation, I think, for a particularly functional political community. So while it does come back to how do you just live with each other, there is an ideal in my mind that involves more consent and less coercion, and the consent comes from people persuading each other what's a good idea. Dan?
I was just going to piggyback on that a little bit about how, in addition to learning how to live with each other and become civil with each other, I think that learning, having respect for positions that you don't necessarily agree with, but I think that it's not so much convincing one side that this other position is better, because you're never going to find that kind of absolute truth. But you're going to hopefully better inform both sides, because a lot of times with students or people in general, what they repeat or something they heard some spin doctor on TV say, or this is a position that's only terribly one-sided, and they don't accept the complexity of things.
Right.
So the deliberation about the complexity is where a lot of the education comes in.
Yes, I think that is certainly the case. And I actually had students come up to me and go up to each other after the one discussion and say, I really enjoyed that because now it makes more sense to me. So it makes the people that you disagree with not, crazy people who are out to get you, but people that you may not ever get to agreement with, but you at least recognize that they have reasons for thinking what they do. And it makes students make better arguments themselves. Even if they don't persuade anybody, at least they have to think about what's working here and what isn't. And I think that's a useful exercise. We're out of time. Yes. Thank you very much.